Don't worry, we are friends.
All right, so now we are joined by Ethan, probably one of the most interesting personalities in the entire ecosystem. Maybe to jump right into the cold water with one of the hardest questions. If crypto succeeds, what does the world look like?
It's a very good question. I think the world looks a lot more. Let's put it like this: the world survives. How's that? Yeah, I mean, I feel like the way we've organized society is quite unsustainable, and we're headed towards some kind of existential crisis on many fronts. And it probably sounds ridiculous to think that crypto could do anything about that, but I think a lot of us do feel that way. That once you look under the hood of all the financialization and number go up and all the sort of nonsense that permeates our space, there's something deeper there about the nature of value and how we organize as communities and human beings, and that at least I hope or am working towards a way for that those kinds of underlying values to help us change the institutions of society to be more sustainable, more local, more representative, more tuned to the needs of human beings and of the environment, more tuned to the sort of biophysics that ground us, and less to just this infinite exponential growth of capital. So so what does it look like? It looks like we survive.
Where do you think in the process until the state we have come now did we fuck up as society?
As society, yeah, well, I ask myself that all the time. People do this. They look and they say, oh, 2008. And they look and they go, oh, no, it goes a bit further back. And, they end up in 1971. And, oh, it goes further back. And then, and they're in the 30s. Oh, further back, they're in the 19th century. Some point you end up in the 16th century. Something pretty significant seems to happen there. But even that doesn't explain it all. You keep going back. Rome fell. No, that's not the answer. You keep going back. You've got the Iron Age. It's not quite it. There's stuff before that. You move back, you're in the Bronze Age. You've got Sumer and early civilization. But even that doesn't feel like, you keep going back. And really, I think it all comes out of the Neolithic revolution, agriculture. Once we started accumulating surpluses, we started fighting over surpluses. And, but even there, you might keep going back, and then, so I guess in the beginning, the universe was created, and a lot of people agree this was a bad idea, and it made a lot of people angry. Yeah.
What precisely made you focus so much on the Neolithic agricultural revolution? I mean, before we had these surpluses and the opportunity to fight over surpluses, we fought for mere survival. So wouldn't you consider that a progress?
Yeah, maybe. That's what I'm saying. You can't really, I'm not sure you can really pinpoint it. Per se, and trying to say, there was some golden age in the past. There's this sort of like romanticism. There's something not quite right about that. And I think I was a lot more prone to that before, and even now sometimes. I mean, it's hard not to be. It's hard not to feel like, no, there must have been a moment where things went wrong, But when you really try to dig in, it's hard to find a specific instance where, there's some barrier where before it was like this and after it was like this. What you do find are history seems to be punctuated by a series of crises, and those crises are, instantiated by real events, real sufferings, real happenings, and you can try to understand those crises, and a lot of those crises have to do with, forms of overaccumulation, and it's certainly the case that, long before agriculture, there must have been fighting, not that we really have evidence of, of it, but definitely, and so. It's hard to say exactly when we got set up on a trajectory towards being, let's say, unsustainable. That seems to be perhaps, something that might have started around the end of the 16th century. Maybe before that, civilization was still oppressive and kind of abysmal and whatever. But at least, it wasn't on track to wipe out the whole planet. Maybe not. Maybe it turns out, we would have wiped out the planet one way or another. So it's hard to really think about these things in the abstract, and that's why right now I'm just sort of like trying to study the history and understand it and not try to theorize too much, but just sort of put the pieces together, yeah.
So, while we are probably not going to be able to pinpoint to any specific development, any specific event, what social constructs, what institutions of our modern age would you consider, the main drivers of the problems we are facing today, and probably maybe focus a little bit on those that crypto may or may not pose a remedy to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, just talking about the surplus for a second, I think economics misunderstands itself, and this is something that I'm still learning about. Economics is framed as about problems of scarcity, but it might be more accurate to perceive it as about problems of abundance and how do you actually, and surplus essentially, how do you actually manage surplus? We are not an equilibrium system, and economics wants to think about equilibria. Any living system, any interesting system is a driven non-equilibrium system, which means there is this input excess energy that the system has to figure out how to do something with, and that's really the kind of the science we need to develop. But the science of economics just developed into a very simplistic science of growth, as if growth was something that could be taken for granted, that didn't have to be grounded in a sort of biophysical reality. It could just be abstracted away, measured in GDP or US dollars or what have you, and effectively be conceived as something that could continue at an exponential rate forever without kind of closing any loops. And so I think that's something that maybe emerged, maybe that conception kind of in the 18th century. I've been focusing in on something that seems to have occurred specifically in the 16th century, which I've been thinking a lot about, which was a transition in the financial system. So before the rise of central banks, we had there was a quite advanced, quite sophisticated banking system operating in Europe that would clear virtually all of the intra-European trade credit without using any money at all, right? Or almost no money at all. And so finance in that time, it existed, it was run by a club of bankers, they were a cartel, they were fixing rates, they were enriching themselves at the expense of others, all that stuff was there. But finance was in service of the real economy and of commercial production and so on. And what happened in this crisis in the 1570s or so is that finance shifted from being concerned with financing production to financing the permanent deficits of states in order to fund war. And that shift, not that there wasn't war before or money wasn't involved with war, any of that, of course there was, but there was a shift in the financial system where we went from financing trade to financing the deficits of states and wars, and we've kind of taken that for granted as the institutional structure of our political economy and states ever since. And that process was actually integral to states coming to define themselves as nations and with their own boundaries, and you get the sort of modern nation state emerging in the 17th century out of this crisis, and you get central banks and all that stuff. So that's where I'm kind of focused right now, understanding that origin, because so much of crypto seems to be about something's wrong with central banks, how are we going to replace central banks, replace them with a computer, or Bitcoin solves it. I mean, it doesn't quite, right? It's not sufficient, and I think to really do something about the problem of central banking and the instability and unsustainability of the banking system and the financial system, you have to kind of understand where it came from and what happened before. And so that's what I'm trying to tune to.
Yeah, I agree that we have to look, at a deeper level. So would you say is the separation of money and state, is that going to be the biggest liberator ever known to mankind?
No. I think
why not?
Well, because I think what we're looking for is a different kind of a union between money and state. I think it's important. So I think money is hierarchical, and the idea that there could be just one money and that we would all just be free if we all just used the global money. I think that's the same kind of thinking, whether you believe it or not. That's the same kind of thinking that gets us into the hole we're in today, where people think, oh, everyone will just be free if they just use the U.S. dollar. Okay, well, the U.S. dollar is associated with America. So the Bitcoiners are like, oh, well, if you just decouple the money from the state, but keep everything else the same, then everything will be great. And I don't think that's right, because I don't think that actually understands what money is for. It's part of money, that sort of store value function, that kind of global, a common kind of, value denominator, but I don't think it's sufficient. And so, my understanding of sustainability is driven by, my studies in biophysics and information theory. And for me, a sustainable system is one that effectively represents its environment, its driving signals, in order to respond to them, to store energy, to utilize energy effectively, right? And I think the idea of going completely stateless or eliminating stateful functions, I think it's kind of missing the point, right? We need institutions, we need forms of governance. Certainly the kind of violence, slavery-based, colonial, extractive states we have now, aren't going to be the states of the future if we're going to survive this thing. So I think we need a new kind of a state, And I think a new kind of money and a new form of money is a big part of that. So I do think we're on the cusp of some kind of constitutional reform. And I expect crypto to be able to play a role in that. But I don't think it's just about separating money and state. That seems too simplistic to me. I think we need new kinds of states, new kinds of money that empower new kinds of more local, more representative states that better respect, the environment and the people that they care about, rather than just capital. I think that's really the crux of it. Yeah.
So where should we start in that transformation process? I mean, of course, we could say, okay, we're just going to overthrow it all, going to do a bloody revolution, but I don't think that would be a very clever way ahead. So how should we approach it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I'm starting with a very simple question. So I'm trying to understand money. What is money for? My understanding of money is that money is for payments. It's for denominating and discharging debt, right? That's what money is. And the store value function is a part of that, but it's not the whole story. And so I can start from a very simple question, which is, okay, how do we develop a payment system to reduce the most amount of debt with the least amount of money? That's our starting point, right? And we call that approach collaborative finance because it turns out through a form of collaboration, which isn't very sophisticated, it's really just being willing to pool information, even in a privacy-preserving way, you can actually focus on reducing the most amount of debt with the least amount of money, right? Which solves a sort of number of problems and gives us a starting point to address perhaps more complicated phenomena, like how we define value, how we create new units of account, what's the relationship between money and states. These are much more difficult questions, right? We can't just show up and say, oh, separate money and state and problem solve, and we can, this is sort of very naive kind of anarcho-libertarian thinking. I think it's a much more complicated question, but at least I think there's a starting point with this problem of payments and reducing debt with less money. And in crypto, there's a tendency to shy away from debt, to say, oh, debt's a problem. There shouldn't be debt, But I think that misunderstands something fundamental, which is that every payment involves a debt. Every you buy a coffee, there was a debt. It lasted for a very short amount of time, but there was a debt, you discharged it with the payment, right? And so thinking, oh, you can just eliminate debt, it seems wrong somehow, right? But you need to encompass debt in a more sustainable framework and a better model. Now, there does seem to be something kind of, fundamentally unsound about states and their approach to debt and these sort of permanent deficits that they never expect to pay back. And that's why I'm very interested in understanding where that started so that we can understand, where it came from and what came before. But I think by starting with this question of how do you reduce the most debt with the least amount of money and focusing on the structure of the payments graph and the sort of decentralized collaborative clearing processes that can emerge from that is the way forward. And what comes next, I don't exactly know. I think we need to chart a new path towards developing a new discipline of monetary economics. 20th century is basically a write-off when it comes to economics. We kind of need to start again, and I think that's the question to start from.
So in your understanding of what is money, what role does the store of value play? Because when I thought about it, my conclusion so far was that at the very bottom layer, we are really just looking for something to store our time and store our energy in. I really like the Michael Saylor definition of, look for a medium that enables you to transfer time and energy through time, space, and domain. Yeah. And the payment function, from what I've understood so far, really is just a result of that. If everybody views something, or many people view something as a good money, as a good store of value, they're going to start to use it as a unit account and as a means of exchange. But at the very bottom core, okay, you have these three common definitions of money, or these common characteristics, so store of value, unit of account, and medium of exchange. But really, what are you trying to store? What are you trying to exchange, and what sort of are you trying to account in? I mean, essentially, the most unrenewable or the least renewable resources of our world are our time and our energy from an individual perspective.
Yeah, I'm sorry to report, I think you might be suffering from Austrian economics brain rot. So it's an infectious virus. I suffered from it in the past too.
How do you recover from that?
There is a cure. There is a cure. You just read a lot of history. Some people think reading history will give you the brain rot, but I think there are ways out. I mean, no, it's interesting. The way I frame the functions of money, so you have the unit of account is for denominating debt. The medium of exchange is for discharging debt here and now, and the store of value is for discharging debt elsewhere or later. And it's true that the store of value function is important. It's very important, and especially in a world like the one we live in today, where there's so much oppression and extraction, and there seem to be many barriers to being able to store value. Coming up with a kind of a payments technology that focuses fundamentally on the store of value is an important intervention, and it's something we need. And this is why Bitcoin is so important, and why I care so much and so deeply about Bitcoin, Ethereum, Atom, and and so on. But it's not sufficient to just have a strong store of value and think that is going to solve the problems of money and payments, because the issue with that is something that stores value really well is actually not particularly effective as a medium of exchange and can lead to deflationary pressures, right? And so you need you do, in the sort of language of the Austrians per se, you do need to be able to weaken the money in order for it to function better as a medium of exchange, right? And that's something that I think is sort of difficult for people to understand. People often look at history and they think, yeah, there's metal in the coin, and the amount of metal in the coin will decrease over time, and that's because the prince is greedy. The king is greedy. They want to take the metal for themselves. In most cases, that's not actually true. That's not the main reason, right? The main reason is because money itself contains its own endogenous instability. Even if you try to make a strong coin and store metal in the coin and keep it there, the coins wear out over time, right? And so because they have a physical material, right? And so the kings were required to intervene in the monetary system to keep it functioning, and they're constantly struggling to keep money circulating and enable these medium of exchange to keep circulating and forming. And so someone like Michael Saylor might come around and say, oh well, now we have digital medium and it doesn't rot like that, and so you don't need that.
Well, yeah, I mean, Bitcoin, it's the first time ever in human history we truly have a scarce and a limited supply good, right?
Yeah, that's true. And that's certainly very interesting and very useful, but I don't think that's sufficient to build an entire monetary system around just that thing as a payments token, because what you need with money, you need money to be able to respond to the dynamics of the trade and commercial environment, right? You need it to be kind of flexible, right? And so perhaps it makes sense to have, and I think, Hal Finney or Satoshi kind of early on proposed these kinds of ideas, that you use Bitcoin as a sort of reserve money, and you build a kind of free banking system around it, because you need the currency to be able to breathe. You need it to be able to be, elastic, to expand and contract, right?
Why precisely do you think that currency needs to be elastic? Because if you think about it, I mean, half of every economic interaction is money. So if you can keep that variable stable, and you keep it fixed and you keep it predictable, you would reduce so much uncertainty.
Yeah, because you need to be able to respond to the demands, the demand for money. And with a fixed supply, hard store value asset, what that ends up causing is it can cause severe deflation. And deflation, because debts can be long term and can be sticky. They can't adjust directly. You can't necessarily adjust the amounts. The Austrians will say, oh, well, deflation is a good thing because, you just adjust prices downward and everyone can just adjust the prices and it's fine. But that's not quite true. I mean, if you just think in terms of like equilibria, okay, but, that's not how society works. And even, a number of Austrians, I think even Mises himself kind of understood this. They realized that, you actually do need some kind of flexibility in money to facilitate, increased demand for money so that you don't create these, oppressive deflationary scenarios. I think originally the Austrians didn't have a better solution. And it feels like there's a kind of there's a kind of giving up. It's like, oh, well, we see these problems. We also see that, inflation is a problem, but deflation is also a problem. So how do you keep it stable? Well, we don't really know. So if we just stick with gold, that's the best we can do, right? And in the later years, I mean, you even have Hayek coming around with his, his book about, decentralizing money issuance and so on. Of course, I think Rothbard really hated that. But I think Hayek was on the right track. I mean, he didn't quite nail it. I think the free banking folks that, were very much inspired by Hayek, Larry White, George Selgin, I think they're a lot more on the mark here. I think even they, haven't fully grokked the whole picture, and not to say that I have either. I just think there's a lot more to the story. But money needs to be able to breathe to accommodate the changing demand for money, so that you don't create these hyper deflationary environments. Which, from the perspective of a Bitcoiner, is a good thing. Oh, you want deflation because you've got the Bitcoins, right? Well, good for you, right? But what about everyone else? And so, if we're gonna survive as communities, as societies, it's not just about this like hyper individualism. It's not about the sovereign individual. It's about the interoperable sovereign community, right? And so you sort of have to change that focus, change where you apply the sovereignty not to the individual but to the community, and focus on that interoperability, and you start to develop new ideas around money.
Do you think that there's any merit to the thesis that having a deflationary monetary system, not necessarily in terms of supply deflation, but I mean in deflation of the price, Because, I mean, if we assume, okay, we have money with a fixed supply, let's take Bitcoin just as an example, and we have continuing technological progress, so things are going to get cheaper over time, wouldn't that be a very interesting opportunity to address the whole sustainability and overconsumption issues? Because right now, due to an inherently inflationary system, we are by nature incentivized to get rid of our money as fast as possible, buy stuff we don't need to impress people we shouldn't really care about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the particular inflationary approach of economics and central banks, I mean, it's flawed in 1,000 different ways in this simple way, but I think probably in others. It's true that certainly allowing some deflation to emerge from, to reflect actual advances in productivity, it's a good thing. I mean, it's certainly a good thing. But I don't think that just having a fixed supply of money is really necessary for that. I mean, I think you can reflect. I mean, we do get to reflect deflationary prices, all over society, even in our inflationary regime. All of our technology gets cheaper and cheaper all the time, and so that does happen, right? And so you don't actually need fixed supply money. Now, the other thing to point out here is it's not even clear to me that Bitcoin itself can survive given its fixed supply. There's a lot of talk about the instability of the block reward, of the blockchain, of the consensus, if the block reward goes too low. I'm personally of the opinion that it might require, people might call me a heretic or not a true Bitcoiner. I don't really care. But I think Bitcoin will probably have to lift the 21 million cap. Oh my God! But yeah, I mean, it's I don't think it's that big a deal for there to be some tail emissions indefinitely. I think that's okay, and it might be required for Bitcoin to survive. And if it's 21 million and death, or more than 21 million and survival, I'm going to take survival any day of the week. And I'm not saying there needs to be some massive inflation, but it might need to be that there's some consistent emissions, and frankly, I think a lot of people probably agree with that, but maybe they're afraid to say it. I don't know. Some people think Bitcoin means 21 million. Well, that's not what it means to me. So, yeah.
So I mean, considering the premise, okay, we need to have money that is kind of adjustable to the demand. How should we approach that? Are there any models we're seeing maybe in the crypto economy right now, looking at Bitcoin, ETH, Atom, anything that impresses you, anything where you think we've went fundamentally wrong, or which of these experiments are likely to yield some good learnings?
So there's a few things to talk about here, right? Because the over-obsession with the store of value compromises our ability to build good media of exchange or to even introduce units of account. So crypto has so far failed to introduce a unit of account, a meaningful one. Right? And the Bitcoiners have this model of hyper-Bitcoinization, and then one day everything will just be denominated in Bitcoin. I mean, this is can I swear?
Sure.
This is fucking nonsense, okay? Sometimes I get in trouble for swearing, so so this is nonsense, and I don't think it reflects any kind of reality or understanding. Again, store value is important, don't get me wrong. Deflation has a valuable element. Inflation, there are lots of problems with it, so don't mishear what I'm saying. I just think we need to be a little bit more nuanced about how we're approaching things. And I'd like to go back to that original question I was asking, which is the question of how do we reduce the most debt with the least amount of money? Because if we focus on that, we're focusing on the payments use case, but we're trying to do it using the least amount of token media. Whether it's gold, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's dollars, whether it's Atom, it doesn't matter. We want to use the least amount of the stuff to clear the most amount of debt, right? Which means to enable the most amount of transactions, right? And you can, it actually turns out that, depending on how society is structured and so on, you can imagine a scenario where if the graph is balanced, if the payments graph is balanced, you actually don't need any money at all, right? I owe you, you owe the cameraman owes me, sorry, I don't know your name. Luca? Yeah. Shuka. Huka. Yeah. Okay. What's his name? Huka. Okay. Sorry to break the fourth wall there or whatever. So if you have this kind of closed loop, right, then you don't actually need any money to settle all those debts, right? You just need to be aware that there's a loop there, right? And so you can generalize this to kind of all of society and to say, start looking at the graph of obligations and the network structure of the debts. And from that, you can run graph algorithms to reduce the most amount of debt using the least amount of money, or actually catering to people's preferences for which monies they want to use, right? So, if I owe you and you owe Huka, then if I'm willing to pay in Atom and he's willing to accept Atom and you're not because, you're just a hardcore Bitcoiner and you don't want to touch anything else, well, normally, we'd be screwed, right? I wouldn't be able to pay you because you don't accept my Atom. But, if there's a chain there and we can optimize over that, my Atoms can be sent to him, your debt can be cleared, and you didn't even know Atoms were involved, right? And this applies, to arbitrary coins and so on. And so I think starting from that kind of model and that kind of thinking and working our way up is very promising. Now, I'll say the research trajectory that I've sort of mapped out for myself, and I think it'll take decades to really work through, is one that looks at the functions of money and specifically the tensions between them, right? Because this is what I was sort of hinting at. There are tensions between the different functions, right? The tension between the unit of account and the medium of exchange is what I'll call liquidity, right? It's this tension of, well, if you have a bunch of debt, how do you know there's enough media to actually discharge those debt, right? And the problem we have with the central banking regime and all this is that, well, they just keep creating more debt, and in order to clear the debt, they just keep creating more media, and then you get inflation, and it's, runaway kind of nonsense and corruption, right? And so that's obviously not sound. And so we need a different approach, but that tension between the unit of account and the medium of exchange, this liquidity tension, is still fundamental. And I think that's one we can start to get a handle on through the problem, through this graph theory sort of stuff I was just talking about. But then we have to, then if you look at the medium of exchange and the tension with the store of value, I've been calling that legitimacy, and it's sort of this question of, well, the store of value function is important, as you were saying. How do you prove that you're embedding value in the medium, right? If the medium is a piece of paper, then there's some trust, it's supposed to be redeemable for something. What's it redeemable for? If it's a coin, well, there's supposed to be some metal in the coin. How much metal? How fine is it? And so on. If you're talking about blockchains, you're using a currency, there's some proof that's involved in creating the token. So there's a legitimacy function there. And I think that legitimacy function has a lot to do with the nature of states and sovereignty and the legitimacy to issue money and this sort of problem. And I think that's a very sort of complex political economic problem to unpack, right? And so that's sort of the next step. And then if you look at the tension between the store of value and the unit of account, I'm calling that solvency. That's, I think, the most difficult one, because there it's a problem. It's really fundamentally a problem of, how do you value things? What do you value, and how do you account? How do you do accounting, right? And that, I think, is really fundamental to all of this. And I think is very difficult, but is part of the picture of solving this whole puzzle of monetary economics, which is really fundamentally, at the end of the day, a problem of accounting. And I think we would do a lot better by sort of abandoning the discipline of economics and focusing on accounting and understanding accounting and the values and subjectivity that actually goes into accounting, and sort of taking that honestly and taking it seriously and starting to build up an understanding of monetary systems from there. So that's at least how I sort of think about the problems here.
Yeah, great. So in that, massacre run you've been doing through these Bitcoiner narratives, and since you mentioned the fourth wall, let's maybe touch briefly on the fourth turning, which is another popular narrative. So, the whole cyclicality of history, and, it's often connected, okay, we're moving through cycles in that pendulum between centralization and decentralization, the whole, hard times create good man create great times create weak man create hard times, and that often gets, related to, okay, now we're somewhere in that cycle, and some of these conditions are going to essentially make the rise of Bitcoin and crypto inevitable. So where do you think how much of crypto's success is just attributed to the historic cycle we are currently just in, versus where do we have to, proactively work on solutions and build a better system that people voluntarily adopt and not just, as a product of these circumstances?
It's a great question. I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I think certainly to a significant extent, Bitcoin was a child of the financial crisis. Obviously, it's been worked on for decades, but the underlying technology has been worked on for decades. But the stamp is in the Genesis block, right? Chancellor on the brink of the second bailout for banks, and so it's obviously very much a response to that, and some of its success derives from how blatantly the discipline of economics failed us, right? It failed us miserably. It is not a real discipline. It is a divination cult. They cut open the pig, they look at the intestines, and they decide how much to increase the interest rates, right? That is the sophistication of that discipline. And so I think Bitcoin is a response to that, and I think certainly a lot of the success of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is due to that failure of economics, but also just due to the failure of the banking system to care about its users, to provide good UX. It's due to the failures of certain inflationary currencies all over the world. There are oppressive regimes. I mean, I see Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as a sort of fundamental extension of the freedoms, the human rights, the international human rights provided by cryptographic tools. Right? It's the freedom to interact, to transact permissionlessly, and that is a fundamental human right that must be protected, and is increasingly important in oppressive regimes and so on. And so I see the general geopolitical turmoil of the last decade or couple decades as sort of certainly contributing to to its success. But I think, that's not, maybe that's enough to ride on, but I don't think it's sufficient. I think we're on the verge of a kind of larger scale constitutional reform being brought about by changes wrought by digital technology, the internet, AI, sort of all these sorts of things are really challenging the way we've defined many of our institutions, the institutions of money, of borders, of citizenship, of how you access information, costs and all these sort of transaction costs, all these sorts of things are being challenged by a sort of new regime of technology, and our institutions need to adapt to that, and I think crypto can play a serious role in that. But I would caution against taking a naive sort of Austrian libertarian, anarcho-libertarian mindset into that reality, because that's not sufficient to actually build the institutions that are necessary to come out the other side. But I think we can do it. We just need to be a little bit more nuanced and humble about what we're doing.
So looking at the current state and the current trajectory of crypto, which novel mechanisms of social interactions and social institutions do you think that whole thing can bring about, and what that is might not be possible so far, but what do you hope it will bring about in the future?
Yeah, so I think what we can do with the thing, so there's this protecting this sort of fundamental human right to transact. I think crypto has actually done that quite well, and the militant Bitcoiner values have actually secured that, and I think that's very important. So I wouldn't compromise on that at all. I don't think that's sufficient to take us into this sort of new monetary regimes we need, but for that, I think we need to start actually going after the structure of the banking system, the institutions of banking, and provide the functions of banking in a more sort of open and democratized way. And I think the way we do that is by looking at the techniques the banks themselves use, particular clearing, which is something all the banks benefit from. They all participate in clearing houses, and I think we want to extend that kind of mechanism, that functionality, to the general public, right? So in a sense, the way I think about what banks did is they said, well, we're going to do a bunch of clearing between ourselves. We'll save ourselves trillions in liquidity, but only we'll have access to that clearing. And then we'll provide a settlement system for everyone else to use, and everyone has to use the settlement, right? And then Bitcoin and blockchain show up and they say, well, I'm not sure about this clearing stuff. We don't like debt. So let's ignore all of that. Let's focus on this settlement thing, and let's open the settlement thing and make the settlement thing available for everyone, right? And I think the next step, which is what we're working on with what we call collaborative finance, it's our response to DeFi, decentralized finance, we've got CoFi, is to say, okay, the settlement stuff is good, we needed to open that, but now let's go back to the clearing function, and let's now make that clearing function available to everyone as well. And they're, actually doing that, turns out it does require consensus technology, atomic execution, state machine replication, all these kinds of things that blockchains provide. And you want to be able to do that in a privacy-preserving way, and you can do that with blockchains. And so I think the privacy element is going to be really important to all of this as well. But it allows you to do a kind of coordination on a monetary function that otherwise wasn't really possible before, or was only possible to be done by banks. And opening that up could have tremendous impact on the liquidity of economies, on the solvency of small businesses, because solvency can be derived from liquidity, and just on the the general capacity for economies to grow in more sustainable ways. And so that's where I think we need to go, and certainly what I'm focusing on.
So in that great transition of essentially society that might or hopefully will also be accelerated by crypto, what role do you envision the broader Cosmos ecosystem to play?
Gonna lead the whole thing, baby. No, I mean, I think Cosmos comes from a set of ideas, right? Sovereignty and interoperability, and I think this future political economy we're working towards needs to be grounded in those very same ideas. And so I see Cosmos as a technology derived from a set of ideas that can allow us to build the next generation of political economic institutions that enable more expression of human values and human differences and similarities across the world, and to start to fill in this kind of spectrum, this hierarchy of scales, essentially, right? And allow us to build systems and institutions that are responsive at different scales. And at a global scale, yeah, perhaps you need something, that's fundamentally focused on the store value function, something like Bitcoin, maybe even something like Ether, maybe something like Atom. But you also need to be able to fill in all the different scales by building, blockchains, institutions that can represent the dynamics and the information and the environment and the driving signals at those different scales, all the way down to the scale of the local community. And so I see the sort of technology and philosophy of Cosmos, and especially of interoperability and ideas around sovereignty, as providing a means to start to reason about how we fill in those different scales and represent things at different scales in the hierarchy. Yeah.
So upon that path to contributing to that greater change of society, where do you think so far, one, we have gone wrong in the Cosmos ecosystem, or where are we still severely lacking, and then maybe expand that to crypto on a broader scale as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's related. I think there's a big risk of just being co-opted by Wall Street and kind of traditional financialization. I see that sort of stuff all around me. Everyone's just chasing yield and number go up and how to make money. And I understand that a little bit of that is kind of necessary to bootstrap these things. And
Well, do you think that people are going to ever be motivated by anything else than fear, greed, and power?
Yeah, I think for a long time people have been motivated by things besides fear, greed, and power. Those things are certainly pretty dominant, but I think we also see, love as a major motivator that drives people crazy all the time. I mean, to pretend like love isn't a huge motivator in human behavior for centuries, millennia, is absurd, and it'll continue to be. And that's not to say that it's, that it's sufficient or that you don't need sound institutional design or mechanism design. But I think there's more to the story than just fear, greed, and power. I do think power, yeah. Power plays a big role in all this stuff, and I'm not sure I really understand power yet. I'm trying. I think that's something we need to take more seriously, especially as we're building these things. What kind of power is imposed by a store of value focused currency is an important question, right? That is something that empowers the creditor class, right? It empowers people that get there early and don't have to do much and just kind of sit on their bags and twiddle their thumbs waiting for the world to end, right? I mean, are those the kind of values we want to espouse? I think there's something important about that, but that's not sufficient. So I do think we really have to understand power better and take it seriously in the structure of our institutions, but I think we can do better, and perhaps we can ground power in the sort of biophysical reality, in the ability to make and keep promises. I'm sort of focused very much on a sort of promise theory of power and of economics and capital and all this sort of stuff. We use a language in our organization in informal systems called the workflow. That's a language about making and managing promises, right? And power comes from your ability to make and keep your promises over broad scopes and longer time horizons, right? And at least that's kind of the approach we're taking, and perhaps that's an approach that could benefit new institutions of political economy as well.
So maybe, sure.
How do you balance power with AI? Because AI basically is very centralized.
Yeah.
And now we're trying to converge blockchain and AI together.
Yeah.
So you have the infinity of AI, and the power with AI is insane.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to repeat the question so our audience can hear it. So the question was, how are we going to balance power and AI, especially under the consideration that, people are looking for blockchain AI solutions like working together right now?
It's a very good question. It's something I'm very concerned about. So I used to work in machine learning. That's where I started a master's. It was in machine learning. I was doing deep learning, neural nets, all the kind of stuff that's really hot now. This was 10 years ago, and I got very concerned that the structure of society, the structure of ownership in our political economy was really immature, and that if AI kind of continued to advance at the rate I saw it going at, it would be a major threat. It would be controlled by a small number of actors. They would use it as a kind of surveillance technology. They would continue to harvest and extract at a much higher rate, and they would become extremely, extremely powerful. And that's actually a big part of what led me to jump ship from AI into the world of blockchains and to say, okay, here is a technology and potentially a philosophy that might allow us to better, democratize the structure of our institutions and spread that power out. And sort of, somewhat decentralize it, right? Or squash the hierarchies a little bit, if you will. And so that's what I became very focused on. I'm especially interested in cooperative ownership models, right? I think the sort of, shareholder-based ownership and all these institutions being geared towards like just shareholder capital, I think is a major problem. And so, Informal Systems, for instance, our company is structured as a workers' cooperative, right? So every employee gets one share, one voting right, essentially. There are separate economic shares, and you can separate voting and economic rights, and that's sort of what we do. But I think more sort of cooperative entities specifically might be a way to help us control these kinds of technologies, but it might not be sufficient. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure if anything will be sufficient. So it's certainly something that keeps me awake at night sometimes. Yeah.